Hi, my name's Stuart Lynch, and this is the 6th video in the Xcode SwiftUI workshop, and in this video we'll be extending our bucket list application to include more information than just the name. I love getting your feedback, so tap the thumbs up button if you enjoyed this video and leave a comment below. Make sure you subscribe to the video and ring that bell to get notifications of new videos. And if you want to support my work, you can buy me a coffee. You can continue on from where we left off in the last video using the same project, or you can download the completed project from the link in the description. Well, so far we've got a nice list, but we want to be able to provide more information about our bucket list items and be able to assign a date when completed. In order to do this, I'm going to create a struct. So first, let's create a new file, and it's a Swift file, not a SwiftUI file, and call it bucket item. Inside there, we're going to create a struct using the same name. It's common practice to make sure that all structs and classes are capitalized and use a camel case afterwards. So capital B and then item is capitalized as well. If we want to be able to use an array of one of these bucket items in a for each loop, we need to make sure that we can identify unique items in our list. But how do we identify something that has more than one property? Well, we can solve this by conforming the bucket item struct to the identifiable protocol. And when you do this, Xcode specifies that we require a creation of an ID property that was going to be unique. So we can use a special object called a UUID. So this will generate a random unique string. Next, we're going to create a property for name and assign it the type string, but not provide an initial value. Then we're going to create a property called note, but we're going to assign it an initial value of an empty string. So Swift will infer then that name's type is a string. And then finally, I want to create a property called completed date. And though things are initially not completed, when working with dates, I prefer to assign an actual date that represents an incomplete date. And I can use a specific date that is a static date property that's called distant past. And this is a unique date so far in the past that there's virtually no chance that anybody would ever pick it from a date picker. So when we need to check to see if a completed date has been set, we can simply compare it to that date.distantPast. Well, for design and testing purposes, as you build your application, it's useful to create an array of sample items as we did for our simple array of string. Well, we can do that by creating a static property called samples in our bucket item struct that will return an array of bucket item. Well, for the return, we can begin by creating an empty array, but within that array, we can create several new instances of a bucket item. And since ID, note, and completed date all have initial values, when we create an instance, the only thing that we need to provide is the name. So we can create one for climb Mount Everest. If, however, we want, we can add additional values to override the default ones. So I'll create a second bucket item with visit Hawaii, but I'm going to add a note argument and create a note as I'm creating this item. And then for the third item, the name is going to be get married, but I also want to provide a note and a completed date because I am married. Well, for the completed date, we can simply use an instance of the date object that will default to the current date and time. Remember, this is just for testing and display purposes. Now that we have our new model and sample items, we can update our bucket list view to use this new model and array of sample data for our project. So back there now in bucket list view, instead of our bucket list being an array of string, we can change it to be an array of bucket item, and we can initialize it as that array that is that static samples property from our bucket item struct. Now, a number of errors occur because we are no longer working with a simple string. But first, we should fix our button action. We'll no longer be appending just a new item string to our bucket list. We'll need a new bucket item initialized with the new item as the name property. Then we can use the append method on the bucket list to append that new bucket item. In the for each loop within our list, we must now iterate not over just a string, but over an array of bucket item. However, we'll no longer need to provide the ID because we have specified that our bucket item conforms to the identifiable protocol and it has to have an ID property. The value for our navigation link will continue to be the list item, but the text view will display only the item name. Now there's one other error that is displayed, and this lets us know that the bucket item must also conform to the hashable protocol. So if we return to bucket item struct, we see that since all three properties themselves are Swift types, which are themselves hashable, strings and dates, all we need to do is add the hashable protocol to our declaration. We need to return now and update our navigation destination type because it's no longer a string. So we'll need to change that to a bucket item.self. And the text view that we'll be presenting will also need to present the name property of that particular item. If we test this out now in the canvas, we see that it basically looks the same. We can navigate to the next view. We can delete items in the list. And we can add items. Well, I'd like to be able to update my bucket list item names right in line here in the list. And I know that we can change a text view into a text field. Well, a text field asks us for a title, which can be a string, and the text argument must be a binding to a string, which means that this is going to update whatever is bound to. Well, the problem right now is that our item is not a binding to a string. It's simply a string. Well, we can fix this in the list. We change the for each array to a binding of bucket lists using that $sign. Now this then will allow us to iterate over an item as a binding, so $item. Now then we can create our text field displaying our label string as item.name, and the text is going to be bound to that $item. To make the entry more distinguishable then and separate it from the navigation chevron that we see, we can apply a text field style of rounded border. We can also increase the size of that text in the text field by applying a font of Title 3. And we no longer need this here separated line between each row, so we can apply a list row separator modifier of .hidden to the navigation link. Now currently, if we type too much into our text field, it just keeps moving to the right. And when the field loses focus, the text will truncate and just show 3 dots at the end. So we can improve on the display of our text field by adding an axis argument and specify vertical, and this will allow the text field to grow vertically as we type. Now, simply displaying the name when we navigate to the next view, that's not really ideal. what I want to do is to navigate to a new view where I'm able to update the other two properties, namely the note and the completed date. So remember, we modified the name property within the list, so I can use that property when I get to the new view as the navigation bar title. So create a new SwiftUI view called Detail View. When this view appears, it will be receiving the bucket item that was tapped on. Unfortunately, this is a copy of the actual item and not a reference to the original, so we'll need to figure out how we can determine which one that is and then update the original properties. But for now, let's just pass it in as a constant called bucket item that is a bucket item type. Well, since this view will be pushed on top of the list view by a navigation link, this view will inherit the navigation stack. So we can add a navigation title to the text view that we have, and we can specify that the title is going to be the bucket item that we passed in's name property. Well, the preview provider is complaining because it doesn't have a bucket item parameter. Well, for previews to display content that requires a parameter, we can create a static property that will represent a bucket item, and we can use one of the three items in our bucket item samples array, like bucket items sample at index 2, and then we can provide that as the argument for our detail view in our preview. Now you may notice that the preview canvas is not showing our title. And this is because the preview has no idea that it's being pushed onto a navigation stack. In fact, we could use this view somewhere else. Well, we can fix this by specifically enclosing the detail view in the preview inside a navigation stack so that our preview at least knows that it's coming from a navigation stack. And with this done, you'll be able to see the different navigation titles. And as you change the array index, you'll notice that the static button item name will change, and so will the title. Well, as I mentioned above, the passed in or the injected bucket item is a copy of the original, so updating it will not update the original. In addition, this is not a state or a binding to the item in the list, so we can't use its properties to update. To solve this, then, we'll create new individual state properties to represent the bucket list properties that we want to update, namely the note and the completed date. And we can give them both some default initial values as we do in our model. So, for example, note will initialize as an empty string, and the completed date will be date distant past. But when this view appears, we want those properties to be updated with the values of the bucket item that we tapped on. So we can create an onAppear block, and then within the onAppear block, we can then assign to those values the values that we got from our bucket item. So note is going to be our bucket item note, and the completed date will be the bucket item's completed date. Well, we can use a form to display the properties for updating. So I'm going to replace the text view with a form block. And as the first row in the form, I'm going to create a text field. I'll use the string bucket note as the title, and I'm going to bind the text to our note state property. As we did in our list, I'm going to add a vertical access to the text field so that it'll expand vertically as more text is entered. For the completed date entry, I want to show an existing date only if the date has been completed. So that means that if it's not equal to that very old date of date.distantPast. So it's not equal to that date, we can create what's called a date picker. And we just need a string for the label, so we can choose the title key selection option. And for the title, we'll use the string completed on. The selection then will be bound to our completed date state property so that when we change it, it's going to update that property. Notice that this is displaying the time as well as the date, and I don't want that. So what we can do is add a displayed components argument to the date picker. And if we only want to display the date and not the time, we can specify that the displayed components are just .date. In the preview, you can see the preview provider will see the date show up only when you have a specified date, other than date distant past. Well, when it's not a date, meaning it is equal to the date.distantPast, we want to set one. So let's create a button in our form. And we're going to set the label of that to just a string called addDate. For the action then, we can set the completed date to the current date. And this is done by simply providing an instance of the date object. Meaning if someone taps on this button, it's going to input today's date as a starting point. This will allow the user then to change it if they like, but by default, it'll be the current date. Well, we can make this button double purpose by using a ternary operator, which we have already seen. That's the WTF constructor. Our what will be the comparison of our completed date to the date.distantPast. If that's true, we're going to display the string addDate. If it's false, we're going to display the string clearDate. Then in the action, we can use an if-else clause to compare the two dates again. In the case that the completed date is equal to the date.distantPast, we can set the completed dates to today's date, else we'll reset it back to the date.distantPast. And we can also apply a button style of bordered prominent to this button here. Testing now, we see that our current item has a date of January 1st, 2023, so the button says clear date. But when we tap on the date, it's no longer displayed, and the button now says add date. And it's not displayed because it's equal to the date.distantPast. Tapping on the add button again, and we see the date again displaying the current date, but we can change that to any date we want. Making these changes doesn't update our original item though. We'll still need to create an update button. Well, the navigation bar has a toolbar that we can add a toolbar item to. After the onAppear block, add a .toolbar. This is a container that can contain toolbar items. Inside there, we'll create a toolbar item and just accept the default override. SwiftUI is smart enough to know that we want to create an item on the navigation bar that you have and you want it on the trailing edge. It's possible to change that toolbar location as well as the location of the items. We're going to create a button then using the label update, and I'm going to leave the action empty for now. Now, SwiftUI is smart enough to know a lot about what we're doing, and it stores that information in what is known as the environment. One of the things it knows is whether or not you have pushed a view onto the navigation stack. And this is stored in what's called an environment variable with a key path of dismiss. That's /.dismiss. Well, we can access that value using an environment property wrapper, specifying that key path, and assign it to a variable of the same name. So once we update our bucket item, we'll want to go back to the main list. So our action, after we have created the updates, we'll still need to code that update part. We can have the dismiss environment property run as an action. And let's add a button style of border prominent to our button here too. For more information on environment variables and values, you can check out these videos that I've created. To update, we'll need to know the complete array so that we can update a single one that was passed in. So we'll have to find that one. This means we'll need to pass it in or inject it from the bucket list view when we tap on it so that we'll have access to it. Well, we're already expecting the bucket item as a constant, which is an unchanging value, but this will be received and we'll need to be able to modify it. And since we're not creating this item here, we can't use @state. What we're going to have to use is a property wrapper called binding, so @binding. And this means that the state object passed into this view as a binding, when updated here, will also update the original state object. The preview is going to complain because it's missing that argument. So we'll fix this in the same way that we fixed our bucket item. We'll create a static property to represent the binding of an array. And we do this by creating a bucket item, specifying the type bucket item as a binding, and then we'll use these angle brackets, and it's a binding to an array of bucket item. And to this we'll assign an array of sample items, but since in the preview this will not be changing, we can assign it as a constant bucket item sample. Then in the detail view, we can add the required argument for the parameter. Note, you'll often see developers take a shortcut here by creating static items within the detail views presentation itself in the preview provider. So we could have written it simply like this. I'm going to leave it the other way though, because in my mind this is more descriptive as to what's going on. We're trying to replicate what we're seeing in our view. Well, we can return to the action now and figure out which one of our items in the bound bucket list needs to be updated. Well, we can determine the index of that by using a findFirstIndex method on a collection, like an array. Similar to the filter function we learned in a previous video, the where clause is a function closure that will return a match that compares the iterator using $0's ID with that specific button item.id. Now, there may not be a match, so what gets returned might be nil. So we'll need to make that comparison. If it's not nil, we can update the note and the completed date properties at that particular index. We'll get warnings, however, because this index may not exist. So what we can do is we can use an exclamation mark on the index that is going to perform what is known as a force unwrap of an optional property. We know that it does exist, however, because we just checked that that index is not nil. So we're okay to force unwrap here. And then the dismiss should be after the assignment, so let me move it down here. Well, we can combine this letIndex and ifIndex is not equal to nil by changing it simply to what is known as a ifLet. So if letIndex is equal to that calculation, it's going to do the check and unwrap if it exists and assign it to index. So we'll no longer need to use the exclamation mark on our index within the body of this calculation or this if clause. Now we'll need to return to the bucket list view now and update our destination. So we'll replace the text view and the font modifier with a detail view. For the bucket item, we pass in the item that we received from our navigation link. And then the bucket list requires a binding to an array of bucket item. And we have that, so we can specify that as a binding by prefacing it with a $sign. I want to do one more thing. I want to use a ternary operator, again, that's the WTF, and apply a modifier to our text field to change the foreground color if the item's completed date is not distant past, which meaning we've actually set a date. We're going to change it to red. If it's still distant past, we'll use the default primary color. Now we've made changes on the detail view, like adding a note and setting a completed date. And save. The updates are done and the view is dismissed. And we can see that those updates have carried back into the list view and the list is updated. You can see now that my climb Mount Everest is in red. Well, this is all fine and good, but when we exit the application and launch again, all of our updates are going to be lost. We'll be back at the same list again. In the final video of this application, we'll look at a simple way of persisting the data and storing it on the device in a secure application documents folder so that our updates are remembered.